With that, I am very proud to introduce Mr. David Sandalow. And his bio is impressive and long enough that I got worried that I'm just going to read it to you, and when I get to the end, you'll understand why. As Assistant Secretary of Policy and International Affairs for the U.S. Department of Energy, David Sandalow helps coordinate policy and manage international activities at the Energy Department. Prior to being confirmed as Assistant Secretary, Mr. Sandalow was Energy and Environment Scholar and a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies Program at the Brookings Institution, as well as the Energy and Climate Change Working Group Chair at the Clinton Global Initiative. He's the author of Freedom from Oil, which was published by McGraw-Hill in 2008, and editor of Plug-in Electric Vehicles, What Role for Washington, that's Brookings Press, 2009. Mr. Sandalow has written widely on energy and environmental policy, including op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, etc. Previously, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, Environment and Science, Senior Director for Environmental Affairs, National Security Council, Associate Director for the Global Environment on the White House Council of Environmental Quality, and Executive Vice President for the World Wildlife Fund US. I mean, that's a pretty storied background. Obviously, this guy's a slacker. He's also a graduate from Yale with philosophy and a University of Michigan Law School with his JD. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Sandalow.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's a lot to get through.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks to everybody for having me here. I really appreciate this. It's great to have the chance to talk to you all. I looked at your agenda. I was really honored to be here. I'm honored to have the chance to open this up. My only reservation, I have to say, is that this is right after lunch. And I know from bitter experience that it's really easy to put people to sleep right after lunch. So to try to avoid that, I'm going to start with a little audience participation here. So how many people here own one or more cell phones? Okay. So think back 20 years. How many people owned one, do you think you owned one or more cell phones in 1991? Got a couple of people. So how many people own a personal computer with access to the internet? And think back 20 years, how many people think you owned a personal computer with access to the internet? Well, we've got some techies in the room here. Okay, so this might be a little bit less than 100%. How many people have ever driven in a car with a little black box that speaks to you in a female voice? For some reason, it's always a female voice, and it says turn left in 1 mile, turn right in 50 feet, into a GPS device. Here we call it, by the way, a GPS device. I learned in England they call it a sat-nav device. So how many people 20 years ago even had the idea of a little black box that would locate you plus or minus 50 feet anywhere on the earth? Got one. Okay. So how many people plugged in their car last time they went home? Got a couple. How many, yeah. How many people have photovoltaic arrays on their roofs? Oh, we got a few. Okay, so in this crowd, now many of you are here because you're particularly interested in energy issues and knowledgeable on that topic. So how many people here think you know the cost to run your refrigerator on electricity for a year, plus or minus, say, $25? Got a few. Okay, so I predict that if I ask those last 3 questions I just asked, okay, on plugging in a car, photovoltaic cells, on the basic information concerning the cost of a household appliance for energy, if I ask those 3 questions 20 years from now in a room, instead of having kind of a smattering of people raising their hands, we will have, 20 years from now, lots of people raising their hand. Because innovation happens quickly, but when we work at it, it can really move. And we've seen with technologies like cell phones, like personal computers, like GPS devices over the course of the past 20 years, how quickly innovations can move. So what I wanted to do a little bit today is just talk about kind of the pace of energy transitions and how we go about making change when it comes to energy and how that can contribute to sustainability. I only have a few slides, but here's one of them that I think is kind of interesting. And this is, so along the bottom, along the x-axis there, those are years, 1870, 1920, 1970. And the y-axis there is the percentage of energy used from each of these sources. So you see, like in 1870, about 75% of the energy that we used, measured as BTUs being burnt, came from wood. And by about 50 years later, about 75% came from coal. And by about 50%, or 50 years later, about 75% came from oil and natural gas. And we're now in this kind of middle stages of another energy transition, I believe, moving beyond the oil and gas age to something else. And you start to see renewables and nuclear growing there. And hydro has the potential to grow. We don't exactly know what the future will bring, but I believe that there is potential for that renewables bar at the top to grow significantly so that it starts to consume a huge percentage of the portion of energy we use. And I think that's the really important element in our overall energy transition. It's not going to happen on its own. It's only going to happen because people have set their minds to it and work on it. Let me just touch on a few specific topics along these lines. One of them, which I think is particularly important, is on vehicles and in the vehicle area. And let me to make this observation. Oil. Look at all the space that oil takes up on that chart. Now, that in the United States, we don't use oil for electricity. Here, we don't. It's actually the only state that really burns any oil for electricity is Hawaii. They do a little. We basically use oil in our cars. And that's true more or less around the world. We use oil in our cars. Now, let me just ask this, or say this. If I'm thirsty and I didn't want to drink water, I could have soda, I could have orange juice. If I'm hungry, if I don't feel like a hamburger, I can have salad or sushi. If I want to drive anywhere on this planet, in a personal vehicle, a car or a truck, why is it that I have only one choice, which is petroleum for a fuel? Today, 95% of the fuel in our cars and trucks comes from this one source, petroleum. And it doesn't seem odd to us that that should be the case because, we grew up in a world in which 95% of the fuel comes from oil, to move our cars and trucks comes from petroleum. Our parents grew up in that world, our grandparents grew up in that world, but I think it's odd. I have a choice in things I drink, I have a choice in things I don't have a choice in the fuel I drive. And the fact that we are so utterly dependent on petroleum in our transportation sector has enormous implications. It has enormous geopolitical implications. It has enormous economic implications. As we know, every time gas prices rise, you basically have no choice. I don't think it's right that for many people, not for everybody, some people can bike, some people can walk, for some people there's mass transit, but for many Americans, the way that our country is built, when the price of gasoline goes up, it basically comes down for them between paying more or staying home. And that's just not right. We need to move to a society where there are other choices. And it obviously has huge environmental implications too, because when you combust petroleum, you create carbon dioxide as well as other pollutants, and that has very significant implications for our planet. So I think we need to be moving to a world in which there are other choices other than petroleum to move our cars and trucks. There are a number of other choices. The one that I'm most excited about is electric vehicles. And we're just at the beginning, I think, of an electronic age. I think the future of vehicles is electric. The only question is how soon. And I've been driving a plug-in electric vehicle now for a couple of years. I had my Prius converted to a plug-in, there's a company up in Boulder that does this. Some of you, I'm guessing. Anybody here converted their cars? Yeah. So mine was done by another outfit out on the East Coast, but I go home every night, I plug in the car in my garage. It's fantastic. I use a regular extension cord. The way my car works, it gets about 30 miles on a charge. But it's a hybrid, so if I go up a hill steeply or if I accelerate quickly, it draws on the gasoline engine. But if I go out of my house and I turn left, I don't go too fast, I have this very sensitive gauge that shows 1,999 miles a gallon for the first mile, which is extremely satisfying. Then I go up a hill, I can't avoid it. There's a hill between my home and my work. I can't avoid going up that hill, and it plunges down to 120 miles a gallon or something like that, which is still very satisfying. But I almost never have to go fill up with gas because I can drive. It's about 5 miles to my office. I drive home, I drive back. I'm using almost entirely electricity. And by the way, the good news is on this front, to drive on electricity is much cheaper than to drive on gasoline. It costs the equivalent of about 75 cents a gallon at national average electricity prices to drive on electricity. And it's, huge potential money savings there. The main constraint right now for electric vehicles is that the cost of those batteries to purchase them up front is pretty high right now. And so we're working at the Department of Energy, where I work, and with President Obama's leadership and others, to try to bring down the cost of that battery so that it becomes more affordable. But as people here probably know, the first electric vehicles are in mass production in the United States today. The Chevy Volt is being made in a factory in Hamtramck, Michigan. They've sold about 12,000 of them so far this year. There's 60,000 going to be made next year. The Nissan Leaf is going to be made in a factory in Tennessee. The first wave was made in Japan, and they've already sold about 10,000 in the United States. And this is happening all over the world. So I think there's huge potential with electric vehicles. And one of the reasons this technology is so important for sustainability is there's really two things. First, an electric motor is much more efficient than that internal combustion engine that you're used to. The internal combustion engine you've been driving your entire life, if you think about it on a cold Colorado day like today, and by the way, it's about, let's see, it's 40 degrees colder here than it was in Washington, D.C. when I left. But on a day like today in Colorado, you drive around your car for a couple of miles, and your engine gets too hot to touch, right? I mean, you wouldn't just put your hand right down on your engine after driving it around a little while. And if you think about it, that's all waste heat. That's all friction, waste heat. That's energy. We should be capturing that energy and using it to move the car for other services, but an internal combustion engine doesn't do that. An electric motor is much more efficient. It's about, the thermal efficiency of an internal combustion engine is about 18 or 20%. The thermal efficiency of an electric motor is like 90%. But now that's not entirely a fair comparison, because you also have to figure where the energy is coming from with an electric motor. But the good news is, if you plug an electric car directly into a coal plant, which you're not really doing in this country, but if you plug it directly into a coal plant, you're still producing less greenhouse gas emissions than if you run your average car on oil in the United States today, because that electric motor is so much more efficient. But the even better news is, and this is hugely important, that as that renewables wedge gets bigger and bigger and bigger, when you plug a car directly into a windmill or plug a car into your solar array, you're producing no greenhouse gas emissions at all. And that's the future right there. That's where we need to be. And there's some companies in the United States that are already doing this. Google actually has electric vehicles powered by a solar array in their on-site. And that's where we need to be going in terms of our overall transportation.